A decision was made in a so-called civilized country like Germany to track down, register, isolate from their surroundings, dispossess, humiliate, and murder every single person of an ethnic group, Jews. I happen to be one of them. And I'll tell you my story. It is slightly different from the norm. I was born in Breslau, which was German then and is Polish now. My father was a lawyer. My mother was a beautiful lady and incidentally a very fine violinist. We had a very happy home. We were 3 sisters. We all learned to play an instrument. I played the cello. My father had a great love for languages, and he maintained that you have as many souls as you have languages. And there was a rule in our house, which I thought was completely stupid, but that on Sundays we had to speak French. I never opened my mouth on Sundays, but I can speak French. Life was normal and good, and then I had my first experience with anti-Semitism. I was about 8 years old, but I remember it to the day. I was about to wipe the blackboard in a small private school that I visited, and a child said, "Don't give the Jew the sponge." Or children would spit at me in the street and call me a dirty Jew. I didn't really understand what was going on. One just had to accept that one was different. Public places started to display signs that Jews were not welcome. Schools closed. We were not allowed to own radios. Bicycles had to be surrendered. And back to the Middle Ages. We had to wear the yellow star on our clothes. One tried to go somewhere safe, somewhere where one was not going to be killed, but as night follows day, it became more and more difficult to find a safe haven. Frontiers closed, and the difficulties one had to overcome to obtain entry into another country were well nigh ludicrous, and enormous difficulties were made by the Germans themselves, who were so eager to get rid of us. In other words, if you wanted to get away, you had to pay. And many people did not get away, and I assure you it was not for lack of trying. My family was among those. On the 20th of January 1942, a conference took place in a suburb of Berlin called Wannsee. Have you heard of it? Wannsee Conference? Yeah. There it was discussed, and it took just 1 hour and a half, how to exterminate European Jewry. And we are talking here of a matter of 11 million people. On the 9th of April 1942, my parents were deported and sent on a transport to the east, as it was called. I never saw them again. I was 16 years old. Now, 2 months after the liberation, I wrote a letter to my sister Marianne, who was in London at the time, telling her about the last hours with our parents. This letter was, of course, written in German. This is a translation, and I'm just reading a few sentences. I'd like to tell you a little about the departure of our parents. We knew a day before that it was going to catch up with them now. Mum cried a great deal. She must have felt instinctively that the end was now coming. Our names were not on the list, but if we had simply presented ourselves, we would hardly have been sent back. But Dad did not want to hear of it. It is better that you remain. Where we are going, one gets there soon enough. We did not exchange many words. There was a lot to do. Packing. We didn't know then that everything was going to be taken off them anyway. Dad did nothing but conclude his or other people's affairs, so he worked, typed, and dictated till late in the night. He said to me I should wait for him. So I took a notebook and a pencil and waited with Mum next door. She cried and cried. She was so frightened. We still had 3 letters before the news stopped. There was nothing factual in these letters, nothing about the circumstances, only at the very end, send food. And in his last letter there was just a psalm. I lift up mine eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help. Help did not come. I often thought of this when things were really bad for me. I'll go back again now. I waited for Dad, and at 2 a.m. he finally called me. He had aged by 20 years that night. He dictated everything I had to do into my book, how to pay the rent and how to pay the gas bill, and he gave me power of attorney to sign his name if ever a signature should be required. I count on you, Anita. You know he didn't easily count on anybody. By the way, I think I coped well with all the technicalities. I had a lot of trouble with the Inland Revenue, who pursued us relentlessly right into prison. But all this is now over and done with. That night was very decisive for me. Yes, we should not cease to be thankful to our parents and live as though they could always see us. After the war, I went to the Wiener Library, that is a documentation center in London dealing with the persecution of Jews. And there I learned that the method of murdering where my parents went was that the victims had to dig their own graves, undress, and be shot into these graves. A very messy way of eliminating human beings. Better, faster, and cleaner ways had to be found, and as we know they were found, we got the gas chambers. The murderers no longer had to soil their own hands. Special commandos were made to do the dirty work for them and herd their own people into the gas chambers. Now my parents had gone, my grandmother had gone, and we had to go to an orphanage. Some time before that, we had been conscripted to work in a paper factory where the workforce consisted of Jews, Poles, and French prisoners of war. My job was to stick labels round toilet rolls, and I became extremely adept at this. I could never accept that I should be killed for what I happen to be born as. So I involved myself in clandestine activities, forged papers for French prisoners of war to escape with, and eventually tried to escape myself, also with forged papers. These papers were leave passes for French civilian workers who, unlike French POWs, were allowed to travel from time to time. It was, of course, strictly forbidden to talk to the prisoners. We chose to ignore this and developed an extremely ingenious way of communicating with them. There were segregated toilets in the factory, and in the toilet for Jews, the bracket holding the chain for flushing had become loose, and you could pull it straight out of the wall, leaving a hole in the wall. And on the other side of the hole was the refectory of the French prisoners of war. We developed a sort of sign language. A prisoner and I would go to our respective locations. I would remove the bracket, and we communicated through this hole by whispering almost inaudibly into each other's ears or passing messages through. Now, my job was to produce civilian clothes and forge the writing on the papers we were given. I was able to write the German script, and I still had a typewriter. One day I found that the hole had been blocked up. I had obviously been observed, but by that time we had managed to get a great many prisoners out. Now the moment had come, we decided to make a run for it ourselves and try to get somehow into the unoccupied zone of France with forged papers. Now just ask whether you know what I'm talking about when I talk about the unoccupied zone of France. Yes? No? Interesting. Nobody seems to know what that is. Ask your history teachers. It was not exactly the most thought-out escape plan, but one didn't think too far ahead in those days. There was only one overpowering thought in one's mind: get out of Germany. We didn't get very far, to be exact, no further than the railway station. We had obviously been watched by the Gestapo for some time. We were arrested and sent to prison. Now, we had committed a criminal offense: forgery, helping the enemy, and attempted escape. These were the indictments when we eventually appeared in court to be sentenced. Now, the absurdity of my situation was that, having committed a criminal offense on top of being a Jew, which was bad enough, actually helped me rather than hindered me. It permitted me to stay in prison for over a year, postponing my arrival at the concentration camp. And when I was eventually sent to Auschwitz, I did not have to go through the usual selection on arrival at the notorious ramp, where the SS chose who should live and who should die in the gas chamber. I had a criminal record, a prisoner with a file, and they did not get gassed automatically. In other words, it was preferable to arrive in Auschwitz as a convicted criminal rather than an innocent citizen. But I wasn't there yet. I was still in prison, and I assure you prisons were not exactly luxury hotels. In fact, it was a pretty ghastly experience. We were 4 people in a cell, which was meant for 1. We were always hungry. We were allowed out for half an hour a day to walk around in circles in the yard, hands on our backs in complete silence. There were no outings to washrooms or toilets in prisons in those days. There was a bucket in the corner of our cell. It did have a lid. I shall leave it to your imagination what the atmosphere was like in such a cell. Now, after nearly 1 year in prison, we eventually had a trial at the Sondergericht, the special court. This was a complete farce. We had no legal representation. Our crimes were plain to see, and we thought naively, the longer the sentence, the better, so that we could remain in the relative safety of a prison. This wasn't so, however. My sister was sentenced to 3.5 years penitentiary, and I was sentenced to 1.5 years in prison. We returned to our cell, knowing that we would soon be separated, a very daunting prospect to face what was looming ahead all by yourself. My sister was duly called a few days after the trial and sent to the penitentiary, and I was alone. Although it was strictly forbidden to talk to anybody in prison, one always finds a way around that. We heard rumors about the gas chambers, and we found it very hard to believe at first, but these rumors were too persistent to be ignored. And it became imperative to acquaint yourself with the diabolical prospect of what was waiting for you if you were sent to Auschwitz. And another rumor was that due to overcrowding of prisons, Jews were unlikely to finish their sentences in this relative safety, but were sent to Auschwitz. And this is exactly what happened. I was given back my civilian clothes, put into a prison train and sent eastwards, direction Auschwitz. I arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau in the evening. Now, Birkenau was an addition to the main camp of Auschwitz, some 3 kilometers away, and it was there that the gas chambers and crematoria were situated. It was beginning of December, freezing cold and pitch black. I was together with a number of other prisoners, all of us with the same advantage of having had a criminal conviction. We waited all night in a barrack and had ample opportunity to acquaint ourselves with the noise of this infamous place. Dogs barking, people screaming, and a nauseating smell. Not very encouraging. Next morning we had to parade past the people whose job it was to take your clothes off you, shave your head, and tattoo a number on your arm. My number is 69388. Now, this procedure had the immediate effect of turning normal-looking people into a sort of prototype, stripped of all human dignity. All this was done by other prisoners, and they bombarded us with questions. Where had I come from? What was my name? What news about the war, etc.? Somehow, and it seemed completely absurd under the prevailing circumstances, I told her that I used to play the cello. Fantastic, she said. Stand aside and wait. You will be saved. So I waited for what I had no idea. It transpired that there was a band in the camp, and she had gone to inform the conductor that a cellist had arrived. Now this band, or Kapelle as it was called, had been formed a few months earlier and did not have a cellist as yet. Eventually the conductor appeared. Her name was Alma Rosé, and a really ludicrous conversation took place. She asked me where I had come from, with whom I had studied. This was the very last thing I had expected when I arrived in Auschwitz. There I was, stark naked, talking about cello playing in Auschwitz. Alma was absolutely delighted to finally have a cello. She said I would have to go to the quarantine block, but not to worry, I would soon be transferred to the music block. Now, the quarantine block was for everyone the first, and for very many people the very last block of Deman on which I came. You slept in a sort of shelf like sardines, and it was a major problem to be able to get out to the latrine in time. I reckon that one's time in quarantine was designed to deprive you of the last vestige of human dignity. You spent hours and hours on roll call in freezing cold. You were not allowed to move, and most of us had dysentery by then. I will spare you a description of what that meant in real terms. After some time in what I can only call living hell, I was called for and escorted to the music block. I was handed a cello and asked to play something. You can imagine I wasn't exactly in top form, but there wasn't too much danger of passing this so-called audition. It was without any doubt the most unusual combination of instruments one could possibly imagine. It consisted of several violins, guitars, flute, mandolins, and accordions. Now, finally, there was a cello. Now, Auschwitz was basically run by prisoners themselves when it came to the daily business of lining up to be counted, the famous roll call or distributing food. Now, these prisoners were the capos, and with very few exceptions, they had been brutalized by having been in the camp for a long time, and were greatly to be feared by the masses. In May 1944, the Hungarian transports arrived. The gas chambers and crematoria could no longer cope with the endless stream of condemned human beings. I am quoting a short passage from a book by Danuta Czech called Calendarium of Events in the concentration camp Auschwitz-Birkenau. The camp commander Höss ordered the digging of 5 ditches for the burning of corpses. The transports were very large, and it happened that the gas chambers of Crematorium 5 was unable to accommodate everybody. Those who could not fit into the gas chamber were shot. In many cases, people were thrown alive into the burning pits. I've seen that with my own eyes. I survived the murder factory of Auschwitz thanks to the fact that I had the great good fortune to become a member of the camp orchestra, and I have no doubt whatsoever that it was the cello that saved my life. I was temporarily of use. I functioned in a community. We were a small group where, in spite of enormous differences in backgrounds and languages, there reigned a real sense of comradeship and loyalty. Now, Auschwitz and Birkenau were surrounded by factories that employed the prisoners as slave laborers. Our task consisted of playing every morning and every evening at the gate of the camp, so that the outgoing and incoming commandos could march neatly in step to the marches. We also had to be available at all times to play to individual SS staff who would come into our block for some light relief after their exhausting work on the ramp where they sent people to their death, or let them enter the camp. In other words, as long as our services were required, we were not really interchangeable, but I would not be faithful to the truth if I said that we had no illusion as where we would end up eventually. We were all under sentence of death. It didn't seem remotely possible that anybody would come out of Auschwitz alive. But a miracle happened. The Russian front advanced, and we were shunted westwards to Bergen-Belsen. No one had ever heard of it. Now, Belsen was very different from Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, people were murdered in the most sophisticated manner. In Belsen, they simply perished. There was no orchestra in Belsen. We sat about and waited and watched each other deteriorate. Belsen was totally ill-equipped to deal with the thousands upon thousands of skeletons who arrived there because of the ever-advancing Allied troops. There are no words to describe this inferno. The dead bodies started piling up. There was no food, no water, nothing. We had come to the end of the line. It was also very hot that April, and although it was very nice not to be freezing all the time, the effect of the temperature on the mountains of corpses was horrendous. Feeble attempts were being made to remove them. Those of us who could still walk were given some string. We were to tie the arms of the dead together and drag them along the road to a big ditch. But this operation was soon abandoned as futile. We were too weak, and the bodies remained in the camp. Corpses were so much part of the landscape that we no longer noticed them as anything unusual. We knew we were at the end of the road and that it was only a matter of time now. We had been without food or water for days. On April the 15th, the camp was deserted by the Germans. We heard a lot of rumbling noise in the distance. That this could be the noise of tanks was possible, but whose tanks? We lived in this twilight zone for almost all of that Sunday. And it was about 5 o'clock when the miracle actually happened. The first British tank rolled into the camp. 15th of April 1945. We were liberated. No one who was in Belsen will ever forget that day. We did not greet our liberators with shouts of joy. We were silent. Silent with incredulity and maybe just a little suspicion that we might be dreaming. It did not seem possible that this nightmare should have ended. And then came the announcement. There was typhus in the camp, and we must remain where we were. Help was on the way. Now we knew all about the typhus. And where should we have gone anyway? We were so far removed from any form of normality that we could not possibly appreciate the enormity of the problems the British Army encountered. They were simply overwhelming. The first priority was to feed us somehow and to find medical help for the thousands of sick and dying people. And then came the problem of sorting out this mess of humanity. The general idea was a sorting into nationalities with a possible view to repatriation. Many, many hurdles had to be overcome before we could be considered members of the human race again. We began to address ourselves to the reality of what now? How do we pick up our lives? And even more pressing was the question, where do we pick up our lives? I had miraculously survived, but there could be no question of going home. What or who would I find there anyway, if indeed I had wanted to go home? So a new phase began. We became a new species, displaced persons, and let's face it, an extremely embarrassing species for everyone. A great deal of patience was needed, but finally, almost a whole year after the liberation, the problem was resolved for me. I was allowed to come to England and I was granted a place in society again. However, I think it is important to know that the Germans had no difficulty in finding willing helpers among other nationals, like the Ukrainians or the Lithuanians. But the streamlined machinery of mass murder was invented by the Germans. Now, no one has put it better than Bernice Rubens in her book, The Brothers, which I strongly recommend you read. Why was this Holocaust more offensive, more foul, more malignant, and more grievous than anything that has happened in history before? It is not a question of numbers. Millions of black people have been slaughtered in their history. Millions of Aborigines Who can count the Armenians? Who dare count the American Indians? No, it's not numbers. This genocide is different from all others because of its sublime and obscene efficiency. Mass murder where not a minute is lost, mass burial where nothing is wasted, human skin for reading lamps, human flesh for soap, human hair for pillows, men's teeth for investment, no waste. A system meticulous in every detail, long premeditated, planned, coordinated, and administered with the most sophisticated and satanic technology, a sheer artistry of murder. In the whole history of murdering men among all his victimized people, there has never been a more accomplished, a more ingenious, more cunning, more terrible cavalcade of cruelty. Let no one ever forget that. Ever, ever, ever. Millions of people perished in German concentration camps, and they died in all colors. Red for politicals, yellow for Jews, mauve for Jehovah's Witnesses, green for criminals, black for asocials, brown for gypsies, and pink for homosexuals. Libraries of words have been written about them based on the Nuremberg trials of the accused and the testimonies of those who have survived. But millions of words were also never written. The basic lack of equipment was one reason for the prisoner's silence: a pencil and some paper. There was also the sheer suspicion of one's own terrible words, that one could actually be dwelling in the hell of which one writes. But above all else, the tale is untellable. There exists no pen for such calligraphy, and no paper that would not ignite in the terrible fire of each syllable. But in God's sight, if his eyes were open in this place, every syllable of every word was true. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much for this very, very moving story of your life. Now, I'd like to ask anybody who's got questions. Please.
So after going through this traumatic experience, sorry, thank you.
I don't hear well, so if you could tell me, okay, go on.
After going through this traumatic experience, do you believe you became more or less religious?
After going through this traumatic experience, do you believe that you became more or less religious?
I have never been religious to begin with, so I didn't have that problem. But that is quite a big subject here about being religious, yes. Well, I never had the problem that I thought that there's somebody up there who's looking down and making sure that everything is okay and that the goodies and the baddies are punished. Yeah, well, it's a big problem. You started there, very philosophical, but I didn't have that problem because I was never really religious. There I say it in a synagogue.
Anybody else? Come on, it's your opportunity, so yes.
Why did they not gas Jewish criminals?
Why what?
Why didn't they not gas Jewish criminal, people who came from prison?
Why did they not gas
Jewish criminal and they gas Jewish innocent?
Oh, I can't answer that. I don't know. Criminals, had a higher standing. I mean, like I told you, it was advantageous for me to become a criminal rather than a Jew, because a criminal in the German system had a sort of, there was a system. A criminal comes in front of a judge, etc., etc. A Jew is nothing. We were nothing. We were dispensable. We were, yeah. So, yeah, to be a Jew in Germany in those days was not exactly a pleasure. And we have to be very careful, because anti-Semitism is raising its ugly head all over the place. So be very careful not to be caught in this idiotic notion that the Jews are responsible for everything that's bad and that all Jews are rich and all Jews want to reign in the world. I mean, this is all complete fantasy.
What kept you going through such a terrible time? How did you keep going through each day?
You know, as long as you breathe, I've been asked the questions before, as long as there's breath in your body, you still hope for some miracle, you know. I wasn't going to give up. There are a lot of people who went to the fence, you know, the fence was electrified. I'm basically a fighter. I wasn't going to let somebody just murder me because they think I'm not worth living. But survival, you know, if you ask people, survival was completely arbitrary. There was no recipe for survival. Even to be young was not. Where you happened to be at the time. I'll give you an example, for instance. When I was in Belsen, there was suddenly an announcement that some people could go on a train and get out of Belsen. Now, we always had a system, never volunteer for anything, because you never know what's happening. Now, these people who volunteered for that were on a train for days and days, finally arrived in Theresienstadt and were liberated by the Russians on the 8th of May. I was already free for 3 weeks before, so you never knew what's going to hit you. So it was always best to just stay where you are, don't volunteer for anything. But survival was completely arbitrary, really. Luck. No recipe for that.
Were you still in contact with any of the other survivors with you?
Yes. Unfortunately, I think probably only 3 of us left now because I've reached the biblical age now. So, but it was about 20 years after the liberation, because I became a professional musician, did a lot of traveling, and knew where some people lived, and so we started to make contact again, and then we started to meet every year on the 15th of, I've got some lovely photographs of us meeting in Brussels on the 15th of April. We're looking all frightfully elegant and happy and celebrating our liberation, but unfortunately nobody left now. There's somebody left who's now 100 in Poland, and I think somebody's still in Israel, but otherwise, yes, we've gone.
How old were you when you moved to London? I mean England, sorry.
When I moved, I was 20. At the time when most people have already done 2 years university.
Did you ever find out what happened to your sister?
Yes.
She was in London, wasn't she? One of
No. Well, I had 2 sisters. You mean the one that I was caught with? No, she's still alive. She lives in France, south of France, which sounds very glamorous, but I'd rather live in London, to tell you the truth. Yeah, she's still alive. In fact, we were invited now to address the German government on the Holocaust Memorial Day. And she came all the way from the south of France to Berlin. Yeah.
And you went as well?
Hmm?
You went as well? You both went?
I spoke.
You spoke.
I addressed the German government.
And how
And
was
I
that
did not
received?
spare. Yeah, I said what I thought. But I'm still. They didn't shoot me, so it's okay.
Does the cello have any good memories for you?
Well, I spent the rest of my life playing the cello, so very important item in my family. My son is a cellist. His son is a cellist and a singer. My daughter's son was a cellist but gave it up. So the cello plays very much a role in our family. Yeah.
During this time, did you ever lose your faith in humanity? And if you did, has it been restored yet?
Have you ever lost your faith in humanity? And if you have, has it been restored?
I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't still have faith in humanity. I think one just mustn't give up. The biggest danger, I think, is stupidity, really. and believe what other people say. You know, when you hear that all the Jews are rich and the Jews want to run the world. I mean, it's all such utter stupidity. So I sort of rely on people like you who are going to a good school and I suppose are reasonably intelligent, that if you find anything that you find is unacceptable in life, that you open your mouth. See? Not be afraid to actually say, you must know what is right and what is wrong. Nobody chooses to come into this world with blonde hair, black skin, Jewish. Nobody chooses. Here you are, Blanc. So make the best of it. Why should it be better to be Aryan and blonde than to be dark-skinned and black? Why should that be better? If you could get that into your brain somehow. I'm not talking you as you, but people. Yeah.
How many years in total did you spend at the concentration camps?
I lost a good 3 years of my youth. I was never a teenager or anything like that. Yeah, 3 years.
Did you ever go back home to see what it was now?
Without what?
Did you ever
go back home to see
Yes,
what it is like
home.
now?
I mean, I don't like to call it home. You mean my hometown? I did, but it's Polish, so it's very strange to come to a town that you more or less recognized, only it's another language being spoken. And it has been 85% destroyed by a stupid German Gauleiter. That's quite a high position in the Nazi hierarchy, who, because the Russians were already standing at the gate of Breslau, which was a very nice medieval town, and told his own people to get out of their houses because he destroyed himself, the houses, to make himself a runway so that he could flee. Charming gentleman. So Breslau has been very badly destroyed. I mean, I've been back several times making films. I think I must be the only person ever who went back to the prison where I was imprisoned, because I do a lot for television and stuff like that. I went back. The prison still stands absolutely unimpaired, and it was arranged that I should go into this prison and into a cell. And I had my daughter with me, and everybody was very worried that I would faint and go back to the prison. I had the time of my life. Can you imagine? I go into the prison, which hasn't changed at all, and I knew that I can come out again. I'm not going, it's not a one-way traffic here. So they opened a cell for me, and there I saw 3 beds in the cell and a television. And my daughter said, "Oh, Mom, this is terrible." I said, "What do you mean it's terrible? We only had 1 bed for 4 people. The others slept on the floor." Forget about television. And what else was there? Oh, yes, and a proper toilet. I said, this is luxury here. So I had a fantastic time. Everybody was worried that I would faint, and I could actually walk out of it again. Not like the first time, one-way traffic. So I've been back several times because people keep making films and whatever. Yeah.
Press something. How hard did you find it to forgive the Nazis?
What makes you think I've forgiven? There is nothing to forgive. I mean, it's quite you started quite a big question there, because there have been entire books written about forgiveness. How can I forgive something? I did not die in a gas chamber. I can't, in the name of the millions of people who are dead, forgive them. No, I can't forgive them. I can move on. You know, I swore when I finally left Germany, I'm German originally, you know, that's my mother tongue. Never ever to put my foot on German soil again. That was my, absolutely. Well, look at me, I keep going to Germany. Took about, and also some peculiar things happening, about 48 years that something happened that made me go back to Germany. And I suddenly realized that I can make a much bigger contribution myself as a survivor and as an eyewitness in Germany than sitting in London hating the Germans. I find the word hatred should be expunged altogether. This is a poison. Hatred is a poison. And not only do you poison everybody around you, you poison yourself. So I don't have any hatred anymore for the young generation of Germans now. You know, I speak to German children, your age, and I can tell you something, that the German youth is very traumatized because there is nobody there who does not think, what did that nice grandfather or great-grandfather by now, where was he at the time? There is this constant suspicion. At least you know what your family has done, not in Germany. So, I've just come back from there, and I'm going next week again, and I speak to a lot of people, and I think it's important. Not all the Germans even now are angels by any means. There's a horrendous tendency to right-wing recurrence and anti-Semitism, and we have to be very careful. I never see a black face in a German school. That immediately. I said, where are they all? Interesting.
Do you ever have flashbacks from your traumatic experience?
What was that?
Do you ever have flashbacks?
Of course I have flashbacks. I keep talking about it. Flashbacks. It's become a sort of history lesson now.
I've heard that many people in the concentration camps got by from songs and music. Are there any songs that you remember?
What is the question?
She heard that people in concentration camps, some of them, got by song and music. Is there any...
By some what music?
By songs and music. That's what kept them going.
What does it mean, get by? What does it mean?
Do you remember any of them?
Do you remember any of the songs or music?
From the orchestra?
Well, I was making music myself, That's what we were doing, yeah. Maybe, if you ever, anybody been to Auschwitz at all? You should take the first chance to go. Because, there are lots of trips to concentration camps. Auschwitz is a place where you should go because all the others, and I've been practically everywhere, are very sanitized. There's nothing, there's pictures and you can see in Auschwitz you see the real stuff, really.
They are a little bit too young to go. They go when they are a bit
How old
older.
are you, average?
I think they're 14 years. 14? 14. So they go when they're about 16,
Yeah.
17.
And go for more than one day because it's impossible. Even now I was again back in Birkenau, again with the film thing. I've forgotten how absolutely enormous this place is. Enormous. Yeah, one has to see it. And there you see the spectacles, you see the hair, you see the artifacts. And in other camps you have to imagine it, you see pictures. There's the stuff is there. Yeah.
You said that you had the tattoo from when they marked you. Do you still look at that and then think back?
Have I still got the tattoo?
Yeah, and think.
Usually that is usually the first question. Yes. Now I ask you a question. Why should I not have it?
No, you do, but what do you think of when you say it? Do you think of the...
And why should I remove it?
No, what do what does it, every time you see the tattoo, do you remember what you went through? That's what she...
I don't have to see the tattoo. But I get that question then, and I said, why do you ask me that question? I said, well, it always reminds you. I said, you don't really think that I'm in the bathroom. Yes, I was. Oh my God. What? Oh, I've completely forgotten. It's not as simple as that. So why don't, I said, would you remove it? Yes. Why? Because it reminds you. I said, well, if I remove the tattoo, I become a Holocaust denier. Why should I remove it? It's not my disgrace. Belongs to me. I'm number 693. I can even say it in Polish, because Polish was the language spoken really in Auschwitz. Anyway, it's there in all its glory.
When you came to England, how did you begin to rebuild your life?
When you came to England, how did you begin building your life?
I have family here. I mean, it was very difficult to get to England. I mean, you had to. Yeah, it wasn't. You mustn't forget, England did not lose the war, but nobody ever wins a war. And when the war was finished in the world, to take in refugees was not number one, on the agenda of the British government. So it took a long time till then a law was passed that if you were a certain age and had relatives in England, you could come. So I had relatives here, and I have no complaints whatsoever about England. I had all the help I could possibly hope for. I got into the musical profession very quickly, and although I had no working permit, the world is crazy. I wasn't allowed to work. But I have to be financially independent. It's a bit difficult if you're not allowed to earn money to not be a burden to the state. Well, anyhow, we got around that, and I was working very, very soon, illegally, but I was never, I would play in an orchestra, and I'd see a civilian guy coming in, and I thought, oh my God, that's the Gestapo. No, I'm in England, it's not the Gestapo. That would be somebody from the police who found out that I'm working when I'm not allowed to, but it never happened. But when I was finally naturalized, I must tell you that there was a file that thick at the Home Office with my name on. So what the hell was in that file, I will never know, but maybe it said, oh, we know this woman went to the BBC, or anyhow. I have no complaints about this country. Yeah.
Right. One more? Okay, that will be the last one.
And ask your history teacher to tell you about the unoccupied zone of France. Not unimportant piece of knowledge.
Would you say you're happiest living in the UK?
Yes. Am I happy to be in the UK?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you for asking those questions.
Be good people, most important.
Now, may I please ask you, we're going to light a candle and we're going to observe 1 minute silence. So may I please ask you to stand up. Thank you.